Okay, cool. So let's get right into it. This is exciting, right? Today we're programming. We're not just passing tests. We're going to start the first part of a two-part CLI project build in the hopes that that's a little bit helpful as far as getting you situated for your project, how to start thinking about it, how to structure it, so on and so forth. And many of you have probably not had a chance to look at the requirements for that project yet. And that's okay, right? You're not supposed to be quite up there yet, right? So it's okay if you haven't really started thinking about it. Just kind of let this wash over you. Just try to take from it what you can, and you can always come back and review it as necessary. Okay. So essentially for this project, there's a few different aspects to it, right? You're going to be getting information, data from some outside site. So either you'll be scraping or you'll be working with an API. And if you haven't, like if you don't know what those terms mean, you probably just haven't hit that point in the mod yet. But sometime after the object relationships, you'll see lessons on both of those strategies for getting outside data. So that's one piece of the project. The second piece is that you're using that data that you've collected, either by scraping or from an API, to then use that to generate objects. That's the most important part of the project, that you're creating instances of a class using that data. And we'll look at some examples of how to do that. For this project we're going to start today, we're going to use an API, but again, scraping is fine. I'm just illustrating how to use an API to do this. Okay. So what is an API? Right? It's short for Application Programming Interface. Right? You might have heard that term before. Think of it like a contract. Right? It's a way for an application builder to say, hey, I'm going to give you access to specific pieces of information, but you need to follow my rules for how to go about doing that. Right? And really an API is just a series of what we call endpoints. Right? Endpoints are addresses like URLs that you can copy and paste into the URL line of your browser. And when you do that, you get back some information from that API. Right? And there are all kinds of fun, easy, free APIs out there, just kind of ready for people to use. So even if you Google fun, free API, right, there's a lot of ones that are nice and easy to get started with. We're going to use a particular one. I think it's Cocktail. Yeah, we're going to use this Cocktail DB. Just a heads up, you guys may not use this API, or I think it's got a sister API here. There's a MealDB one that has the same icon. You may not use either of those APIs. It's just too similar to what I'm going to show you now. So just neither of those two. Right. Now, if we think about this API we're using, it does have like a user-facing site. Right? For a normal user, they can go to this URL and they see a list of cocktails. Right? You can get the name, you can click on a cocktail for more information. That's just what it looks like to the user. Okay? But they do offer an API that developers can use. Okay? So when we navigate over to their API, it looks a little bit different. They have kind of some introductory information. You can contact them, but then they have a bunch of API methods that you can use to access data from their application, right? So when we're thinking about endpoints, this is what we mean. It's just a URL address that follows a specific pattern, right? So let's say, for example, you wanted to find a specific drink by its name. They're using margarita here, but that's just a pattern, right? You can enter that URL, and what you're going to get back is kind of this funky data that we call JSON, right? It kind of looks like a Ruby hash, right? Whereas this looks like it's a hash that's got an array inside. JSON is short for a JavaScript object notation. In JavaScript, an object is essentially what we call in Ruby a hash, right? So this is how we generally would get back information from an API, right? And again, this is just an endpoint, right? We can modify this pattern to an extent. So like, let's say instead of a margarita, we wanted a, I don't know if this will work. We'll try. Bloody Mary. Well, they get back null. They didn't find what we were looking for. We probably just need a more specific name. They also will let you search an ingredient by name, which is what we're going to be using in our API today. We can say, hey, give me back all of the drinks that you have with this particular ingredient in it. Okay, and again, we get back some JSON, we get some ingredient information, we get a whole long description, and a few other pieces of information, right? This is my JSON. I can manipulate this, so say I wanted cocktails with lime, for example. I'm still following their pattern, their endpoint pattern, but I can adjust it for any values that are dynamic. Cool, right? And then they give you a variety of different features to either filter by, search by. It's always good to have a sense of what options you have working with an API. Don't try to complicate things too much from your project. Just start looking around now, getting an idea of an API you want to use if you want to go with an API, and just see what options you have available to you. Okay. So here we're going to be searching ingredients by name. Okay, cool. Okay. And then once I have this data, right, this JSON they pass back, this is now information I can consume or make use of in my application, right? I get it back in this format, and I'm going to have to deal with it based on the format that it's in, but it is usable information that I have for my application, right? And again, the whole idea here is that these programmers, they've made a contract with us as programmers that, hey, we're going to offer these ways to get information from our API, right? If you follow our rules, you get that data. Okay? So it's an alternative to scraping. Scraping is sometimes considered a little bit more invasive. Not every site is open to being scraped, and they might have measures in place such that you can't scrape. This is just an alternative, less invasive. It's less likely to break because if you're scraping, for example, that's really based on the structure of the website you're working with. So if that HTML or CSS changes, like the things you're using for your selectors, you might find that your site just breaks over time or doesn't work anymore. Just something to consider, APIs generally are going to be a little bit more flexible. Okay. And let's see, some other examples of APIs. A nice easy one is GitHub. Right. So they offer their own API. Right. And generally APIs will have some kind of guide about how to use their API. Some are just more extensive than others. Like lots of people are using GitHub's API either for OAuth or like letting you sign up with their application. So it can get a little overwhelming. Just try to keep it as simple as you can. For here, right, so this site has a root endpoint. This is like the basic address I would use to start working with their API. So even if I just start with that root, I get back a little something. And then any other endpoint I want to use is going to build on that. It's just going to add on to that URL address. So like here, let's say I wanted to get repos, like repositories. So let's say I might want to list repositories for a user, right? They're going to give me the general address I would use, the pattern, right, to accomplish that. Okay? So here it follows the pattern of users, and then this is the dynamic value. This is the name of your user, your GitHub username, and then repos. But I would literally just add this pattern on here, okay? And then I can sub in my GitHub username or the name of the user I want to look at their repos for, right? But again, it's just a contract. I'm following your rules. I'm following your pattern, right? And because I've done that, you're now going to give me access to this data. So like now I've got a bunch of JSON about my account. It knows my username. I've got an ID in their database. It probably knows, probably got my email in here somewhere, not seeing it offhand. They've got the name of one of my repos. So all kinds of information you can potentially pull. It just kind of looks ugly at first glance, right? Let's say I wanted to look at my boss's repos. Right? Again, I'm just following their pattern. I'm using their rules, and they're giving me back the correct data in response, right? Which is really all that it boils down to. Okay, cool. Okay, So let's go back to our cocktail API, get rid of some of this extra stuff. Right, so really it's just a recipe that we're following, right? So let's think about this app that we're building today, right? It's nice to have at least a rough sense of your functionality before you start, because it gives you something to work with, right? It can be a little overwhelming to start an application because there's so many ways to start building it, and it's not necessarily clear how to do that. In terms of what we're trying to build here, we want an app that will basically let a user choose an ingredient that they want to get drinks by, right? So something like sugar or vodka or honey, what have you. Then my goal is to display a list of drinks with that ingredient for the user. So they're going to see that, right? And then they'll have the option to pick one of those drinks and get more information, like the recipe or instructions, right? So that's what we're going for. In terms of how to get started, we're going to build a really simply structured application. You could literally follow along with me if you wanted to. It's not hard. There's just a couple patterns that we'll run into, right? So if you follow along, you'll have a project too. I'm choosing to store my project here. You can call your folder whatever you want, wherever you want to store your projects. It could be the same as your lab if you're working locally. If you're using the sandbox, there's like a procedure that's linked on how to do that to build your application. It's in that project planning section of the module. So there's a video where Dustin walks through how to make your own repo in browser IDE and then connect it to GitHub. We're not going to do the connect to GitHub piece here, just the actual project flow. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is create a project. The command that we can use to make folders from the command line is this makedir command, make directory. A directory is just a folder. I'm going to call this project CLI project. You can call yours whatever you'd like. Okay. I'm going to make that folder, and then to navigate inside of it, I can use the change directory command, cd. So I'm going to cd into my folder. Okay. What I'm going to do from there is I'm going to make a bin folder, which is going to be used to hold the file that runs my program, my executable. So I'm going to make a folder called bin. I'm going to make another folder called lib, which holds all the other important files for my application. Right, so make dir lib. And then the one other thing I'm going to make at this level is a README. So a README is just a file that gives your users an introduction to your application, how to use it, how to get it down on their system, that kind of startup introductory information. To do that from the command line, we have access to the touch command. This is a command that just makes files for you. So I'm going to say, hey, in my project, let's make this file called readme md. The convention is that it's upcase like this. So then now I've got a bunch of stuff in my project. This command ls is short for list. It's just going to show me what I've got going on in this current folder. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and open this project so far. On my system, I can do that with Atom. If you're on VS Code, I think the command is open. Or actually, it's code. There we go. So then I'm going to open my project. Okay. It's very simple, but it's got the general file structure that I need to get going. Oh, interesting. I just started using a second screen, and I'm still getting the hang of it. But it opened gigantically. Okay, so this is my very simple file structure, right? I've got a folder that's got nothing so far, another folder, and then my README. Right? So first thing I want to talk about is this bin folder, right? This bin folder holds the file that's the entry point for your project, right? It's the main file that runs your whole project. I'm going to go ahead and make that now. I can right click here. I'm going to call this drinks. It doesn't have a file extension for reasons we're going to talk about in a second. Right. So in this executable file, right, a common pattern is to have this special line of code at the top that basically tells your program, hey, just a heads up, this is a Ruby file. Run it as Ruby. The format of this can vary a little bit. You guys can use mine, but it starts with, it starts with a hashtag and an exclamation. There we go. You see my computer's been freezing up a lot. So it starts with those two characters, and then this pattern, bin and Ruby, which is basically just telling your machine, hey, run this file as a Ruby file, right? Because I'm specifying to run it that way, I don't need an extension here like .rb. And for anything else in this file that I'm requiring that's a Ruby file, I don't have to specify RB at the end of the file name. I can, I just don't need to, right? So again, this is called the shebang, right? This is a term you want to be familiar with, right? There's a good chance you'll be asked about it in your assessment. You don't have to know the details of like how it's working under the hood, just the idea that like, hey, that's a shebang, right? It's telling the computer that this is a Ruby file, and without it, I'd have to add .rb at the end of all my files, right? So really all it does is it tells the computer, hey, this is a Ruby file, run it as Ruby, right? So just like that, I have an executable, right? One thing we want to get in the habit of, like as we're building projects, is just kind of making quick checks to confirm, hey, this is working like as I go along, right? It's nice to have sort of little steps that you build and then confirm as you go along. Otherwise, you run the risk of having a big mess of code. It might be broken and you're not sure like where it's breaking. I'm going to go ahead and just run this. The command to run your CLI is just Ruby and the path to that executable file, right? So I'm in my current CLI project folder. I've got this bin folder here, and inside of it is that drinks file. So I'm going to say, hey, compared to my current directory, right, find this bin folder, and then run this drinks file, right? This little dot here is just short for like related to my current directory, right? So I'm in this CLI project, that's my current directory. I'm going to go one level deeper into this folder and then run this particular file, right? And I'll get that started now. That actually ran much faster than I was anticipating, right? So we get confirmation that, hey, that file is being run, right? Now I'm going to add some other files here. I'm going to add a folder to my lib. Conventionally, this can mirror the name of your project, so I could call this CLI project, but I'm going to call it something more semantic, like bartender. It technically doesn't matter too much what you call this, right? So this folder is going to hold kind of all the other important files I need for my application, all of my classes. Right. Inside of this folder, I'm going to add a few different files, right? The first is going to be my CLI class. Right? So I can even start off with a simple class just to start. This is my CLI. And then what does this do? This file specifically is responsible for handling input from my user and output to my user. Output TP to my user, right? So that's the responsibility of this CLI. It's command line interface. The command line is our terminal, right? This is how the user is interfacing with our application. That's how they're using it. So that's what this CLI class is responsible for. I'm going to add another class here for my API. I'm going to call that API.rb. If you're using a scraper instead of using an API, you'd still follow a similar pattern. You'd just call this something like scraper.rb. Okay. I can make a class here. Okay, cool. It's a bit laggy. So what is this responsible for? This is my service file or class. This file class. It's responsible for talking to my API, essentially, for communicating with my API, going out to it, getting my information, and returning it. Okay. So that's its job. I shouldn't have any any methods related to my API inside of my model, for example. Right? We want to be really careful about separating our concerns. There's totally many different ways to write Ruby code. We could, in theory, have one file that handles everything, right? But that's monstrous to debug, right? So the idea is we have different classes, different files that have their own responsibilities. So if anything goes wrong, it's a lot easier to find out where that's happening. And it just makes it easier to read and understand the flow of our application, right? So this class is responsible for communicating with my API. And then I'm only going to make one other file. This is my model, right? So I'm going to be making drinks. So I'm going to call this drink.rb, right? The most important part of this project is that you must make objects based off of the data you're getting, right? So this file is really important. It's not enough just to define my class. I'm going to have to also use it in other parts of my application to make drink objects. And I'm just going to start with the basic class. This is drink, right? So this is responsible for making drinks. That's it, nothing else. Okay, cool. And I think the last file that we need is our environment file. This always confuses me. This file has to go in this lib folder, but not inside this other one. So we're going to add it here. And this is my environment.rb file. Okay. This is responsible for listing all the dependencies for my project, right? That's its job, right? So just like that, we have the file structure that we need to create a project, right? It's pretty lightweight. There aren't too many files involved. If you do go like with the option of building a gem, you're going to have a ton more files, which can be a little overwhelming. You don't have to do it one way versus the other. This way is just nice as far as getting started really simply. So either way is fine. There are drawbacks for one or the other, right? If you publish yours as a gem, or sorry, if you build it as a gem, really the main benefit is that you can publish it. So if you see in the project section, there's a video where Avi like goes through a project build and he built it as a gem. You totally can do that. I'm just giving a simpler alternative if you just kind of want to focus on the basics, get a project that's simple to get started, get up and running, and still meet your project requirements. In the project description, there's like a README devoted to that. It mentions building your project as a gem, but that's not a requirement. So don't feel like you have to build it as a gem in order to proceed. You can totally keep it simple like we're doing here. Okay, cool. All right. So then let's look at our executable file here. Right, so we said this is the entry point to our application. This is the first file that gets run. Because this is the first file that gets run, I have to make sure that I am able to get any other information that I need to run this file. Right, so I need a way of linking my dependencies. So the way that we handle requirements in a project, like linking the other files that you need, is we have two main keywords. We have the require relative keyword, and we have require. And students can get a little confused on which to use when. Essentially, with require relative, I know where the file I need is compared to where I currently am in my application. So I'm going to give a file path that's relative to the file that I'm in. For require, this works with an absolute path. It's what we would use when we're like, hey, I need this gem that's installed on my system. I don't know exactly where it is. That's like determined in my shell path or whatever. So if you don't know exactly where the file or gem you need is, like where it lives, you'd use require. But if you know exactly where it is relative to your current project, you can use require relative. We're going to use require relative here because I'm going to require this environment file, and I know exactly where it is relative to the current file that I'm in. So I know, hey, this is where I am here. This is kind of the same level in my program. I need to go sort of up a level into this lib folder and into that environment folder. So the way that we say that in programming is like, hey, let's go up one folder let's go into a folder at that level, our lib folder, and let's access this environment.rb file. Cool, that looks like it's spelled right. So that seems all right. So I'm just requiring that file, and then I can easily test that by then putting out here. It here, right? And again, we're just going to repeat that process where we're just confirming, hey, I'm hitting the points that I need. And here we did make it there. Perfect. So then this is the actual file in which we list our dependencies. We don't want to clutter our executable file with all that. We're just like linking another file that has our dependencies for us. So there's a few different things I'm going to require here. First, we're going to start with some outside gems that are going to make this project much easier to build. So the first thing I'm going to do is require Pry. Many of you guys have used Pry before. It's going to really help as far as troubleshooting your application as you go to make sure it's working as you expect, right? And if it's not, like, you can investigate why it's not working the way that you intended. So that's the first gem we're going to require. We're also going to require this gem called HTTP party. Okay. So I've got this pulled up here. So this is a gem that makes it nice and easy to work with an API in a Ruby application. Okay? You can look it up yourselves if you want to look at the documentation, right? But really, it's a way to make HTTP fun again, right? So we can use it to interact with our API. There are some other examples that are mentioned in the lessons on working with APIs for those of you who've seen it. I think they use NetHTTP and OpenURI. You're welcome to use those, right? There's really not one right way. I just feel like this gem makes it nice and easy to get started. Okay, cool. And then, oh no, frozen. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we're back here. The last gem we want to require is the JSON gem. This is also mentioned in those lessons where you work with an API. It's really responsible just for parsing the data we get from our API into nice, easy to read JSON. And we'll talk a little bit more about like how it does that and why that's helpful, right? So this we use for debugging, right? This is for interacting with my API, and this is for parsing the data from the API into JSON. Cool. Okay, so these are my outside dependencies. I don't know exactly where they live on my system. They're somewhere, so I use the require keyword. Now, for my other requirements, these are just files that live in my application. I know exactly where they are relative to my current file or folder, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is require my actual CLI class. So we're using require relative. And again, the idea is, hey, we're here in the current level that I'm at in my directory. I want to go into this folder and then require these 3 files. So where we go? Here. Cool. So if I want to say relative to my current folder, I can use the dot to do this. And I'm going to say, hey, go into that bartender folder and go grab that CLI file. Right? Again, I don't need the .rb here because of that shebang that I have in my drinks executable. I'm going to copy paste this over because it's the same general pattern for the other 2. Once it lets me do that. Cool, and then I'm just going to update the name of these. There's my API class, and there's my drink class, right? And then that's all we need as far as listing our dependencies. You can go a little crazy if you want. There are lots of gems you can use to like prettify your CLI or add some customization. If you do plan on using an API, I would probably write these guys down as a nice place to get started. Okay, cool. So then I think I have all my base classes. That looks good. Let's talk CLI. So again, the purpose of this class is to handle interactions with our user, right? The convention for your CLI is to have an instance method called run that is in charge for executing the general flow of your application, right? So there's nothing special about the name of this method. It's just a convention that we use, and we write it as an instance method, right? And again, this is just going to execute the flow of what your application does. So let's say probably a standard way to start this off is to greet the user. So you might do something like put hello and welcome to my bartending app, right? Just something to welcome them. And then you guys will see it's helpful to add a little bit of formatting and white space in your CLIs because it just makes it a nicer output to the user, a little bit less ugly. All right, so I'm just going to add some white spacing here on either end. Right? So there's our instance method. And then the convention is in your executable to make an instance of that class, right? And then call that method on it. Remember that methods in your classes, they're just instructions. They don't actually do anything until you call them. So here we're going to make an instance. We're going to call it CLI. And that's a new instance of my CLI class, right? And then what I can do is I can call my instance method on it, right? And now we're going to do just what we did before. We're going to confirm that this works the way that we expected it to, right? So if I run my CLI, do we greet our user? Or does everything break? Okay, cool. So a little bit slow, but it did the thing, right? What some of you might find is that when you get to this step, you might find that one of your gems breaks, like it complains. So like the first time I used HTTP party, I got an error that was something like undefined variable HTTP party or like gem not accessible. So what you might find you have to do in your terminal is like a gem install HTTP party or a gem install pry, right? So a similar idea. And then just double check that you have all of these like spelled correctly and the casing is right. Cool. All right, so going back to our CLI. So we've kind of got a rough start. We can greet the user, but then we want to sort of envision what we want to happen after that, right? So in the scope of our application, the idea is that we want to ask the user for an ingredient, and then we're going to display to them a list of drinks that are made with that ingredient. So I might start with something like put enter an ingredient to see drinks made with that ingredient. Right? I've given them an option, and then I need a way of actually grabbing some output from them. The way that we do that is with the gets method. Right? It's designed to kind of hang in your terminal, wait for a user response, and then grab their response as a string. Right? So at the most basic level, this is how we do that, but we also need to control for the fact that a user may not use our application as we intended it. Right? You always want to validate your input, sort of like you want to act like your user's built upside down. They don't know how to use a computer. They might do things wrong. And you want to account for that because you don't want your application to break on them, even if they're not totally following the protocol. So a couple things that we do commonly to help validate our user input are to strip any white space or like line breaks, because they might have a space before or after their response. They might add some extra white space some other way. And this is just to kind of remove that because we don't want that to throw off our logic elsewhere. What we also want to do is account for case, right? Because the user might type something all uppercase by mistake. They might mix their case. And we don't necessarily want to have a bunch of conditional logic to handle every single case. What we could rather do is be very controlled and say, hey, whatever I get back from them, remove any white space and then down cases. So I know exactly what case I'm getting when I get input from the user. And then what I'm going to do is store this in a variable. I know that I'm going to want to use this variable and other instance methods in this file. So I'm choosing to use an instance variable, right? If you're not sure like what the scope of your variable should be, a nice rule of thumb is to give it a narrow scope and increase it as you see that you need to. I already know that I want to use this in other instance methods, so I'm going to make it an instance method. But if you're not sure, just start it out as a local variable. Basically, it takes up less memory and it impacts fewer places in your code if you try to minimize your scope to just what you need. Okay, cool. So then here we have to do a little bit of like creative visualization, because otherwise it can be a little hard to know how to proceed. The idea is that from this point, like I get some input from the user, and then my goal is to go to my API, right? Ask them for drinks with that ingredient. They're going to return that data from me, right? And then I'm going to use that to display more information to the user. So those are the general steps. Cool. Right. So one thing that Avi talks about in some of his videos that's really helpful is to like visualize the code that I wish I had and then build that myself. So in terms of this part of our program, it would be really nice if we had something like an API method we could call, something like get drinks. Like, hey, API, go out and get these drinks with this ingredient for me so that I can then do something with that data, right? It's the API class's responsibility. It's not my CLI's job to go out and do that. It's not my drink file's job to go out and do that. I've got a class that's responsible for dealing with my API, and it's that API class. We could sort of debate whether we want to use an instance method or a class method. Here we're going to use these as class methods, but it's kind of a small distinction. Like I'm not going to make multiple instances of my API class, just the one. So I might as well just have this as a class method. Now, we don't have this method yet. We got to build it ourselves. So if we're thinking about what we want to do here, there's a few different questions we want to ask ourselves, right? And let's start with just kind of the basic class method. So I want a method. I want it to be a class method, something like get drinks, and then it takes in an ingredient as an argument. Okay. And then the idea is that I need this to go out to my API, right, and return that data. So a few questions I want to ask myself are as follows, right? What is my endpoint? Where am I trying to go to get this information, right? That's the first piece. What's my endpoint? There we go. Right. How do I go there and how do I get what I need? Right? It's going to return to me some JSON, and then my next step is how do I handle that JSON and turn it into meaningful data, something I can work with. And then finally, the most important question, how do I make drink objects from that data, right? Okay, so first question is, what is my endpoint? That's gonna depend on my API, right? So I go back to my API and I think, what am I trying to do here? I'm trying to get a list of drinks by their ingredient. So there's probably some functionality to search by ingredient. I don't want to search by the ID. I want the actual name. There we go, search by ingredient, right? That's the functionality I'm trying to use. They give a couple examples. We're just literally going to copy paste because we have their format, their rules. Right? But this is just kind of a starting point. Right? We have to store this as a string. So it's got to have string quotes on either end. Got to close it on both ends. I'm going to call this something like URL. And then the one thing here is we want this to be a dynamic value. So we're going to use interpolation to do that. The idea is we're going to take the actual ingredient that we're inputting, we're going to inject it into this string so that we get a dynamic endpoint that responds to whatever the user actually wanted to see. Right? So we just copy that endpoint. It's a little bit long. This is actually not right here. I'm going to copy that ingredient. There we go. Now it's a little bit easier on the eyes. All right? So then how do I go there and get what I need? Right. So through HTTParty, we have access to a method that we can use to go out and get a response from our API, right? It's just a recipe. It's a particular pattern to follow. If you want to have a better sense of what it's doing on the, under the hood, you can look that up in the API docs. But really, for our purpose, it's just a recipe. We follow the format. So what we do is we have access to this method on this namespace class here, right? So this is a class that we're working with, right? It's got access to a get method, right? And then what I can do is pass in some information related to my URL, right? Again, you don't have to have a deep understanding of how this is structured. It's just a recipe that we're following that's going to go out and interact with our API and then return a response, right? I'm going to store that in a variable. There's nothing special about the variable name except that it's reminding me that it's my response for my API. Cool. So then now this is probably a good place to check some things. So we're going to add a binding.pry here. I need to require it where I'm using it. Or actually, I don't think I do have to require it here because we required it in our environment file. But let's see. We're going to go, we're going to run our executable because that calls this method. And then if we have any luck, okay, so we're here, it's waiting for us to enter an ingredient. Let's try lemon, and bam, we're inside of our method, right? So we can look at our URL, that's just a string, right? But now if we look at our response, we get a whole giant mess of information. Crazy looking, right? Essentially what we're getting back is a ton of string data here, right? The only thing that you can send across the internet, right, and this is important, the only thing that you can send across the internet are strings, right? So what we're looking at here is a bunch of stringified JSON data. So it's JavaScript objects that have been basically turned into strings here, which is why we get this really ugly formatting, right? So every single thing here is a string. Even the curly braces are in strings. It's all just a long string. The reason that we use this JSON gem here is to help parse that into something we can actually do something with, right? One thing you'll find in your terminal, like when you get long pieces of data, you get kind of this like little hanging bit here. If you hit the down arrow key, you can scroll through it if you want to take more of a look. But if you just want to type in your terminal again, you can type Q, and now I can interact with this normally. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this response, and then I actually have, oh, I got this wrong. So we have a method that we have available to us from that JSON gem called parse, which is doing what it sounds like. It's going to take all that string data and parse it for us and return nice JavaScript objects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it that response. So I called that response in my code, and it doesn't like it. Response for, because I misspelled it. Oh, I see. Missed an S, right? It doesn't know what you meant. It only knows what you said. Okay, cool. So then this here is the good stuff. These are our JavaScript objects, right? JavaScript object notation. Right? It basically just looks like a hash for us, right? I've got a hash with a key of drinks that points to this whole long array of information about drinks, right? I can scroll down if I want to take more of a look at it, right? But really for each of these drinks, I just have 3 pieces of information. I've got the name of my drink, right? That's a value for this key. I've got what looks like a thumbnail. That's how that displays the different pictures of each drink. And then an ID, just to keep track of that unique ID, say, in a database, right? Pry is a nice place to kind of poke around and make sure that you can grab what you want. I know that what I ultimately need is this array because that has all my drink data. So I can access it via this key here. So if I do something like json.parseResponse, I can literally just chain this on here, right? This is the name of my key, right? This is why we spent so much time on hashes, right? We want to be able to access keys in a hash, right? Because a lot of times we're getting data from that hash, right? So if I enter that by key, I get nil because I think it's actually pluralized. Right, there we go. So now I get back my array. I can do things like ask about its length. I can do things like grab specific drinks at once if I want to inspect a little bit more, right? So we see our first drink is an amaretto sour. We've got its thumbnail. We've got its ID, right? So these are just some of the ways that you can poke around, but really the key piece here is that we're using this parser from JSON to actually turn that stringified data into something we can work with. So I'm just going to copy paste this over to my application. It's a little bit laggy. Okay, cool. So then here, I'm going to take that response and I'm going to store it in an array. I think I'm just going to call it drinks, or we could call it something like drinks array. I'm going to make it pluralized just so I know it's a collection of things. Okay, cool. So I think that's a good place. All right. So then we ask ourselves, like, okay, this information that I have, what am I ultimately trying to do with it? I want to make drink objects, right? In this project, you need to make objects. So this is going to return an array to me. What I can do is then iterate over that array, right? Because each element represents some data for a drink. So I can use it to make objects for that drink. So that's kind of the next step, what we're working with. So when in doubt, start simple. I can start with something simple like each because I don't think I'm going to care about my return value here. So I'm going to iterate over, let me see, let me restructure this a little bit. How do I handle that JSON and turn it into meaningful data? How do I make drink objects from it? So we're just going to pull this here. Uh-oh. There we go. Cool. So I'm iterating over that array of drinks, right? I can use each, right? I want to call this something semantic, so something like drink or maybe drink object. And the idea, actually, it's not a drink object yet, it's drink details. And the idea is that from those details, from the information I have about a drink, I'm going to make an object. So I'm going for something roughly along the lines of make a new drink and then pass in some drink details, something along those lines, right? And again, I haven't really built out that functionality, but I'm just trying to visualize like what is the end goal, like not the end goal for the whole project, but for like the functionality I'm trying to implement right now, right? I want to make new objects. So then I got to smarten up my drink model a little bit because right now it knows how to do not so much. So we'll start with some basic functionality. I'm going to need some setters and getters. I know I want to keep track of the drink's name. That's in our JSON. I want to keep track of the drink ID for something we're going to implement later. I'm going to keep track of the specific ingredient that we're associating it with. And then later on, I'm going to need some instructions for how to make that drink. So these are just kind of attributes that I know I'll need at some point. You can always like start with a couple, make sure you can make objects, and then kind of build from there. Okay, so I'm probably going to need some saving functionality. We want to keep track of those objects we're working so hard to build. So I'm going to initialize a class variable. That looks good. I'm going to need an initialize. And then for right now, we're going to pass in the name and the drink ID. We'll handle the others a bit later, but we're just going to start simple for now. So I'm going to pass in 2 attributes. And then based on that data that's passed in, we're going to follow the standard pattern. I'm going to make name based on the name data, and I'm going to make the drink ID based on that drink ID data. Okay, cool. And then since we are going to keep track of all our instances, we probably want a way to read out that value. Just going to return that variable. And then we can always decide later if we want like an outside save method, but really we just need a way of keeping track of our current instance, right? So I set its attributes and then I save it to this all array. And this is kind of a good place to sort of get started, right? Your actual models themselves should not be overly complicated, right? You're going to have some outer accessors. You're going to save your instances, so you need a class variable. You're going to need an initialize. But then outside of that, you shouldn't need too many methods. Maybe if you wanted like a couple of class finders, like a find by name or like a select by name, you might have a few methods along those lines. But what you should not have anywhere in your model, right, is methods that do scraping, methods that hit APIs for you, stuff that like is involved with greeting your user, right? Those are all extracted to other classes. Our drink class is not responsible for that. It's only responsible for making drinks, finding drinks, keeping track of drinks. Okay, cool. So then now going back here to our API, we're trying to visualize. So we know we're going to pass some drink details here. So what is this going to look like? Oh no. So if we look at the data we had before, this is an example of a drink and what it's going to look like, right? I know I'm passing in the name. I can use that to set the name. I know I'm passing in the ID, so I can use that to set the ID. So our drink details here are a hash. If we're not sure how to poke around in that hash, again, this is a great place to use Pry, because you can actually get some feedback on what you're trying and how it's working or not working. Oh no. So a parentheses has gone awry somewhere. So this is in my API line 8. This guy looks good. Oh, I see. So I'm missing a parentheses on line 6. I've got a nice little extension on my text editor called, I think it's called Colorizer. It just makes it a lot easier to see what parentheses and brackets match up with what. So it's worth looking into if you're on your local. Okay, so I think I should get better results now. And alas, I've not. So now, something about an end. You guys see I do this all the time. I lost my do. So I need a do for my end. I got an end and a def here. Okay, cool. So we're catching a break here. We've got our ingredient we can enter. We're inside of our Pry. We can look at drink details and then think about how do I go about using those to set attributes, right? I know essentially I'm going for something like drink.new and then I pass in a name and a drink ID. Drink ID. So something along those lines, but I got to pull that data from my hash here. So I would say something like, okay, go ahead and grab this first piece here. That's how I get the actual, see, something about this is not right. We should be getting back a hash, but instead we're getting back an array. Maybe it's because I should have a second key value here. So something like, well, let's see, drink details. Well, first off, what's this actual array look like? If we look at drinks, okay, it is a hash. I'm not going crazy. So, oh, we only grabbed the first one. That's what we did. We needed to grab all of them. That's why we're getting weird results. Because the idea is we want to be getting back an array, and then we're iterating through that array. So this explains why it's a little bit funky. Okay, So again, I'm just making sure I get that whole array. I was just getting one item when I had it with a 0 here. So now this makes more sense, hopefully. So now, if I look at drink details, so I get an actual details for a drink. So this is a little bit better. I gotta fix this syntax. This is a little bit wonky. I'll fix that in a second. But the idea is that we want to be able to access these values by key. So like if these are my drink details, if I want the actual name of the drink, I've got to use that key string drink. Right? If I want to get the ID, I've got to follow their rules. So I'm going to use the key of ID drink. ID drink. Right? So that's how I can access that data. So then there's a couple ways we can do this. We can do it right in our method call, I suppose. We're just going to copy paste that over. So we want to get the name of the drink, and then we want to get the ID. We're going to use that later. I'm not going to set it this way. We'll do it that way later. But we're going through and we're passing the drink name and the ID. Okay. I'm going to clean this up a little bit because that's ugly. And then now, there's a couple places that we could probably test this functionality. I'm just going to do it right here, but I just want to make sure I get some nice drinks when I run this program. Oops, not that. Cool. So then I'm going to run my project. I'm going to enter my drink. We're going to keep with lemon for right now. Cool. I end up in my Pride here, and then I want to see my drinks. And just like that, like magic, we've got these beautiful drink objects that we've built. They've got a name. They've got, well, right now they've got a drink. So that probably should be drink ID. So that's an issue in my class. Drink. We're calling it drink. That's great. It should be a drink ID. Right. So that itself should be easy enough to fix. Again, if you want to get out of this, you can just hit Q. We're going to try again. But again, remember that like the main piece of this project, right, is that you have to make objects based on the data you get from your scraping or from your API. If you do not do that, they will make you do the project again, right? That's like the main thing that they're looking for. Okay, we want to be good object-oriented programmers. Right? So then now, if I repeat myself, I've got these beautiful objects. They've got names. They've got IDs. I've got plenty of them. Right? So this is where the good stuff is. Right? We have to make those objects. Okay, cool. I'm going to do like a light refactor here. If you're on PACE, you should have seen the math assignment lesson so far. We're basically just going to refactor this method here to use keyword arguments, right? Which are nice because essentially when we use keyword arguments, we don't have to strictly enforce the order in which we're passing our arguments. If you've seen some of these object relationship labs, like especially that has many through with like the doctors and the patients, you really can get weird bugs if you don't pass your arguments in the required order. And keyword arguments can be a nice way around that. So really all I have to do is define these as keyword arguments. I can do that just by adding a colon at the end here. So now these are keyword arguments. And then in my actual API, I'm just going to adjust my syntax a little bit. Okay. So then what I can do is I can say, hey, this is the name that I'm setting here. And this is the drink ID that I'm setting here. Okay. And we can always refactor kind of to our heart's content. Start by implementing it a simple way and getting that to work. Right? And then if you want to build on top of that, like if we wanted to make this a little bit nicer, we maybe could do something like name is our drink details here. And then maybe even the same thing here. D equals. A lot of this just comes with time and practice and like how do you want your application to look? What makes the most sense to you? What's easy to read? This I think is a pretty good start. It's not too hard on the eyes. Let's just make sure that if I run this, it still works as we expect, right? So we always tweak a little bit. We poke around to see if it's working as it's expected. Okay, cool. Now if I look at all of my drinks, they're still looking good. So I think we're all set on that piece for right now. Okay. So again, the idea is to like step by step, I'm checking like, hey, am I good? Is this working the way that I expected? Right. So now we're back in our CLI. We've pretty much implemented this functionality as much as we know, right? We can make our drinks. So then if we think about what we want to do next, the idea is that I want to display a list of drinks to the user, right? And then tell them, like ask them to pick a drink. Okay. So that's kind of where I'm going next, right? But first we need this listing piece, so that we have to build ourselves. Now, again, sort of thinking along the idea of like, how do I write the code I wish I had, right? We want to be saying something like, hey, let's say I have a method that extracts this logic. I call it print drinks. I want to be able to call a method that I say, hey, go ahead and print these drinks, and I actually pass in the ingredient that I want those drinks for, like all ingredients that have, all drinks that have that ingredient. So I'm saying, hey, it'd be really nice if I had a method that knew how to do that. If I give it an ingredient, it prints all the drinks with those, right? So now it's on me to go and build that method. So then we got that. Print drinks.all. So I want to go ahead and build that. Just print drinks. So I want a method that takes in an ingredient, and then it's going to go through and print all the drinks made with that ingredient, right? So maybe we have a little bit of formatting here. Cool. A little bit of white space, make it look nicer. And then I say something like, just something to help orient the user. You'll see this kind of makes sense as you go along. You want to help them understand what's happening as it's happening. But I might say something like, here are the drinks made with whatever your ingredient is. That's going to be dynamic. So I'm going to go ahead and pass that in. Actually, I'm going to change this a little bit because we're not passing in the current ingredient. We're actually, like, we need a list of drinks to be working with here. So I think the idea is that we want to get all of our drinks. So I'm passing my array of drinks as an argument. Those are my actual drinks as an array. And then, so this is why. This is why I wanted this as an instance variable. So I have access to it in our other methods. So we still have the ingredient. Right? So again, my goal here is to have a method. I pass it my array of drinks, and then it knows how to go through and list those out to the user, right? That's the CLI's job because it's the one that's building like any interactions with the user, right? So then now I've got an array to work with, right? A lot of times with CLI apps, you don't necessarily care about your return value, at least if you're like printing something out for the user at that moment. So probably an each is a nice place to start. So I'm going to iterate over this array of drinks. A really nice helper method when you're listing information is the dot with index method. You may have seen that before, or you may have seen the each with index method. They're both pretty similar in that they give you access to the index in your pipe, right? The dot with index is going to be really nice for a reason I'm going to show you now. Basically, when we use this dot with index, we have the option to specify a starting point for the actual indexes. So either way, we're going through all the items in the array. We always start at 0. But if I say, hey, as far as my user-facing output, like start with 1. So when I go and I set up my pipes here, I'm going to get access to the current item, which is a drink or a drink object, and then I get this index. Starting out this value here will just mean that this value starts out as 1. So it's just really nice for formatting because humans start at 1. We don't start at 0 like computers do. So then our goal is to go through and loop through all of our drinks. And then we can say something like, hey, like this is the name of my beer and this is the number, right? They need a number to reference because then they're going to choose one of those numbers in the next step. So we can interpolate the actual index, and then maybe we add in the name of the drink, right? So again, we're working with objects here. This is an object. How do I ask it its name? Drink.name, right? And then maybe I add a little more formatting flair, right? And now we're just going to check, like, hey, are we good? Is that still working as we expected? I think I've got a problem.